Welcome to The Quo, a community of challengers, disruptors, and changemakers. I'm your host, Payal Patel. Join me as I dive into stories at the intersection of gender, race, and social and economic issues. This podcast series spotlights individuals from various industries, disciplines, and walks of life who are challenging the status quo. Through interesting and thought-provoking conversations, The Quo aims to elevate the voices and stories of endeavoring change agents in hopes of empowering communities and inspiring meaningful change within our society through education, advocacy, and the power of storytelling. Are you ready? Let's get it. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Quo. Before we dive into this episode, I actually want to read off a couple of words from a book that I recently read. And they go like this. I feared being known. I tried to blend in as much as I could, and in the process, I lost so much of myself, of my culture, of my Mexicanness. These are the words of Julissa Natzely Arce Raya, as written in her national best-selling book, My Underground American Dream. She's written 2 other books after building a successful career on Wall Street, working for Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch, 2 of the biggest and most well-known financial institutions in the world. So you might be wondering, what could she have possibly feared? Well, for more than a decade of her life, Julissa carried the burden of a secret that could have ripped everything she earned and treasured away from her. After immigrating to the U.S. from Mexico at the age of 11, Jaleesa went on to live for almost 15 years as an undocumented immigrant in the U.S., and her story of navigating that period in America amidst all the tension around immigration is both harrowing and powerful, heartbreaking, and yet full of light and hope. So I'm looking forward to talking to her about that in this episode, along with the new book that she's publishing soon called You Sound Like a White Girl, The Case for Rejecting Assimilation. I have a feeling we're going to find a lot of resonance on that subject matter too. But what I really want to dig into is her work in immigration activism, social justice, and education equality, because that work is the unequivocal embodiment of challenging the status quo. And that's what we're all about here, right? So before we meet her, here are some of the highlights on Jaleesa. She's a co-founder of Ascend Educational Fund, which is a college scholarship fund and mentorship program for students regardless of their ethnicity, national origin, or immigration status. She serves on the board of directors for the National Immigration Law Center. Her first book is being developed into a TV series with producer and actress America Ferrera. And of course, there was this one time that she was interviewed by the Queen, Oprah. So you know, the pressure is on. Anyway, I'm so excited for this discussion, and without further ado, I would like to welcome Jaleesa to The Quo.
Hey, girl. Hi, thanks for having me. I was jamming out to the music.
Oh,
the intro music.
The intro.
It was good.
It's a vibe, right?
Yeah, it is.
Well, I'm so glad that you're joining me for this really important discussion. By the way, I read the book. I've got the book right here for those who are watching on their visual medium, but those who are listening, I'm holding up her book, My Underground American Dream, which I found so compelling, and I learned a lot. Like, there was a lot in here about immigration policies that I didn't quite frankly know or understand until you framed it in the context of your story. So thank you for sharing that piece. And as a daughter of immigrants myself, I found some of the content in here relatable, but I want to be clear that obviously I, as someone who did not have the experience of an undocumented immigrant, I can't relate to all of it, obviously. But there are some themes of like our families coming to the U.S. in pursuit of what they believe to be a better life, full of possibilities, endless opportunities, known as the American dream. And so that was a very real concept for my family, and as it was for yours, as you put in the book. So where I want to begin is, what did the American dream mean for you when you first arrived to the U.S., and what does it mean for you now today?
Yeah, so that book, My Underground American Dream, came out in 2016, 2015 maybe. So it's been a while, but my latest book, which now I'm holding up, You Sound Like a White Girl, The Case for Rejecting Assimilation, just came out March 22nd. And the reason I mentioned my new book is because for people who have read my first book, who will read this next book, you will see a really big shift in terms of what I think the American dream is. And I think even in that first book, I sort of start questioning, right, whether the American dream is real, whether the American dream is worth it, whether the American dream even exists, right? And I think in many ways, my own story is used as an example of the American dream, right? Because I went from selling funnel cakes on the streets of San Antonio, Texas, to as very cheesy headlines would say, selling derivatives on Wall Street, right? And isn't that sort of like the definition of the American dream, that you can come with very little, have very little, and still be able to have a very successful, a very financially fruitful life in the United States, even when you're an immigrant, even when, I was undocumented for 10 years, even when my parents didn't have the college education that I was fortunate enough to have. And I do think that in some ways that is an example of the American dream. But I think that we sell the American dream to the rest of the world without telling the truth behind that dream, right? Without talking about the sacrifices, without talking about the fact that it's not a dream that's attainable for everybody. It's the exception, not the rule. And so I think that we have to really question this idea of the American dream, who it's for, um, and really, I think my American dream now is sort of like making sure that the dream is attainable for more people, that it is a dream that everybody has access to, that everybody at least has the opportunity to pursue, because I don't think that everybody does, and I don't think that it's a dream that is real to many people.
Yeah, and I kind of felt the same way in kind of seeing my parents' story evolve over the years, and what they were sold on, and then when they came and how that changed. And but it's still ironic that the words American dream are still so prevalent in society, right? Like it's still this, like, you come to the US and you're gonna magically be granted all of these opportunities. And while they exist, sure, it's there are layers of barriers, right, that a lot of immigrants have to first encounter and go through. And specifically, you mentioned that your book was published in 2016. Well, come 2016, for many immigrants, especially those who were undocumented, the American dream practically became the American nightmare, with the Trump administration looking into overturning DACA, the Deferred Action for Children, Childhood Arrivals, a policy put into effect during the Obama administration that offered some protection to undocumented individuals who were brought into the country as minors. Now, it's important to note that DACA still did not offer a pathway to citizenship for those individuals. And even under the Obama administration, more than 400,000 people were deported each year. And you noted that in your book. But it provided somewhat of a lifeline. And then there was the then proposed DREAM Act that would have been an expansion of that policy. But we know that it's faced a lot of challenges, and passing it has been an uphill battle, to put it lightly. Anyway, your book was published in 2016, and that was during the height of tensions related to immigration laws and reversals that meant more deportations, leading to a lot of people living in even heightened state of fear. What did you notice during that time within the undocumented community, and how did it, if at all, influence the way you wrote your book?
I mean, that's a lot.
I know,
That's a lot.
I know, I threw a lot. Sorry about that.
That's a lot to unpack. Listen, like I think what I was really trying to get to in sort of sharing some of that data and some of that information, and I go way deeper into it in my new book, is that Trump was a symptom of a system that has been building since the beginning of the founding of this nation. Like I talk about in You Sound Like a White Girl, my new book, about the lie of legality, right? This idea that immigrants can come to this country and that they should do it, quote unquote, the right way. And this right way doesn't really exist for many people, right? And from the very beginning of the founding of this nation, who was viewed as a citizen was very specific, right? It was who could naturalize as an American citizen were white men who had lived in the United States for 2 years or more, but it excluded many people, right, including people like me and you and our parents. Um, and so immigration policy has, from the beginning, been tied to race more than any other factor, more than economic factors, more than national security factors, more than anything else. It's been tied to race for who can and cannot come into this country. And so I think if you, and I provide many examples of how that's been the case historically. And then you fast forward to, what happened in 2016 with Trump, and, DACA, for all intents and purposes, has been dismantled, right? Like, new people who are just now turning 15 who would be eligible for DACA cannot apply because they're not accepting applications for new applicants.
Right.
Luckily, through the work of a lot of organizations, DACA has been reinstated in a very limited way for people who already had DACA, so people can reapply, but there are no new applications. But here's the thing, during Trump, there was this like outcry, this like public outcry about like the kids being separated at the border, right? And you saw it everywhere. But guess what? That's still going on. The underlying law, which I don't want to bore you with like all the different, specifics, but it's called Title 42. Like, Title 42 is still being used today under the Biden administration to separate families at the border. And like, where is that outcry? It's like we've all forgotten. So like, this stuff is still going on, whether it's under a Democratic or a Republican administration. I want to be clear that like, Biden is not the same as Trump, and like, I would much rather have Biden than Trump in office because we can push him in a different way. However, I think this administration is still failing immigrants in a very, very big way.
Just in a different way, right? But it's the same deal. And I think a lot of people forget that because it's so politicized. It's so like, oh, this party is for immigrants and this one is not, and that's not the case. Like, it's been ongoing. It's been, as I pointed out, the Obama administration still had really, really high numbers of deportation. So it's ongoing. And actually, I even saw a social post of yours that had this statistic: 57% of immigrants are Latino, yet they make up 90% of deportation cases. So what you're saying there about race being embedded in these immigration policies is very real, where you didn't have that with potentially European immigrants, right? And it's very different in the way that this is all divided. And so, can you expand on or share ways in which you found U.S. immigration policies to carry such prejudices?
I mean, there's like a million examples. I mean, you mentioned sort of the percentage of immigrants that are deported that are Latino, and then within that, Latino immigrants who are Black Latino immigrants are deported at even higher rates than any other immigrant, right? Like I said, there's like so many examples of how the law has changed when immigrants have become browner. So just one quick example. Prior, and I forget the exact sort of date, but when the majority of immigrants were white European immigrants, there were no restrictions for accessing safety net programs like welfare and Medicaid. And in the 80s, when there was a large influx of Latino immigrants, is when many of the restrictions that we know today were put in place. Because now that immigrants were more brown, now we needed to restrict access to those safety net programs. And there is many examples that, I particularly talk about in You Sound Like a White Girl, of how that's been the case, of how the laws change and they're designed in a way to keep Black and brown immigrants out of the country.
Yeah, sorry, I had to come off of mute. My doorbell was ringing. I have Amazon packages waiting outside, but as is the times of being virtual, right? So, no, that makes a lot of sense. But how do you respond to people then who say that immigration laws aren't strict enough and America can't just take everybody?
Well, I think that's a very, very narrow-minded way of looking at things. And I do think that the United States owes a great deal to poor people around the world on whose success, uh, whose poverty is our success. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see how, um, corporate interests really drive foreign policy, and foreign policy eventually creates immigration patterns, right? I know, like, for example, when we talk about NAFTA, the sort of controversial trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the US, which has now been replaced with a new trade deal. But when we talked about that sort of trade deal, we talked about sort of all of the people in the Midwest who lost jobs because all of a sudden there were factories being built in Mexico, and so these companies were looking for cheaper labor, and so all these Midwesterners lost their jobs. But guess what? In Mexico, farmers who had been able to grow corn and sell corn and make a living selling corn were put out of business because the US was dumping corn, because corn is very highly subsidized by the US government. And so all of these farmers in Mexico lost their farms, and without the ability to make money any other way, many of them then had to come into the United States, many of them without paperwork because there were no legal ways to come into the country. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk about sort of what has the impact of that been. And I think many times immigrants are scapegoated for economic issues, for national security issues, such that we are distracted from the real root causes of many of the issues that plague our country.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people don't have that context, right? I can share an anecdote of this is just recent. I think it was 2017. I was sitting at a bar in a suburb of Chicago with a fellow South Asian American friend and another friend who is Black, and we were just hanging out, minding our own business. And there was a white woman at the bar, a couple of seats down from us, and she probably had a few and felt very open, and that liquid courage was pouring. And so she turns to us and just declares that we should go back to our country. And my friend immediately stands up and goes, "What did you say?" And I had to yank him down, but I was kind of like a deer in headlights for a moment, because I'm like, what year are we in, and how is it possible that people still have this mindset of go back to your country? When this country doesn't, it's not like it belongs to any of us in the first place, right? I mean, we're all immigrants. We're all coming here from different places, unless you're of indigenous background.
Or
But
unless you were brought here, unless your ancestors were brought enslaved and
correct.
forcefully into the country.
Exactly, right. And so I didn't really know what to say. And we kind of just sat there for a little while and in silence. But I'm curious to know, has that comment ever been thrown your way, and how did you react to it?
I mean, so many times.
Yeah, I figured.
Whether it's like, less so in person, because I think people just get really bold when they're, some screen name on a computer.
Right.
But people have gone out of their way to find my email and like send me this really nasty emails. I mean, the way that I respond is by writing books, right? Like, I address this entire idea of going back to your country, going back to where you came from. In You Sound Like a White Girl. Um, I sort of just ignore it for the most part, but then um, when I start sort of seeing these patterns, it's kind of like, okay, like, why do people believe this? Let's try to like unveil the truth about it, right? But most of the times now, like, if this were to happen to me like in real life, I think I'll probably just laugh away and ignore it, because like, who has like, I don't have the time or the energy to engage with racist people anymore.
Right.
like
Yeah.
like I'm not going to change their mind, like.
And I was just going to ask you that, like, I mean, you say that you've written these books, but are those people really picking up these books and trying to make an
I
attempt
don't
to
really
learn?
care if they are or not.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I could
Right.
care less if, like, racist grandma is like picking up my book.
Yeah.
There was a time, by the way, and I talk about this in the book. Like, there was a time when much of my work focused on preaching beyond the choir, right? And like changing hearts and minds. And I went on Tucker Carlson 3 different times. And I fully regret going on his show, or any of the other Fox News shows that I went on, because I used to believe that maybe I could make some sort of difference, right? That maybe I could, if people heard my story, that their hearts would be moved, and that there would be some shared humanity between us, that they could hold on to and view immigrants differently. And I have done a complete 180 on that, because it was exhausting to do. In some ways, it was, I felt like it took away my dignity to have to convince someone to see me as human. And now, uh, I don't want to spend my time doing that. I want to spend my time energizing the choir. Like, I want
Mhm.
to spend time making sure that the choir feels loved and seen and understood and empowered. And by the way, like, I got an email once from this 70-year-old man who said he was a lifelong Republican, and he read my book, My Underground American Dream, and his heart and mind was changed. And that's one. Like, great, I got one. But that's not the focus of my work, and it's a big shift in perspective, because the way that I write now, um, is not centering white people in my writing. I'm centering us, like brown people, specifically Latinos and Latinas and the Latinx community. Like, that's who's centered in my work. And I do hope that, I try to make my work a welcoming space for anybody who's ready and willing and has a desire to learn more. Like, you are welcome into my space. But I'm not spending my time bringing you into my space, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Like,
no,
if
of
you
course.
come, I will embrace you, I will answer your stupid questions, and like, I will love you, for wanting to learn and wanting to get out of your bubble. But I'm not going to spend time bringing you into the space. That's just, not for me anymore.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you know where your time and energy is best spent, and is it accurate to say that you are speaking to audiences like yourself, or people who can see themselves in your experiences?
I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we are still all, when I tell the history of Mexican Americans, and of other Latinos in this country. I mean, those are American stories, and we all should want to learn more of the history of our country.
Yeah, it's part of our collective history, and there's also much talk about this right now about not being taught enough in schools, and so we're trying to fill the void with our voices, and I'm all for that. That's why I started the quo, right? Like, I
Yeah.
started it because I felt like there wasn't enough of our voices being centered, and I'm talking about marginalized communities historically. Black, brown people, people of color, women, and so that's where my energy has been focused on. I do want to pivot to, I mean, we've been talking about your new book, but I want to talk a little bit more about You Sound Like a White Girl, in which you describe on your website as a manifesto against the myth that assimilation leads to happiness and belonging for immigrants in America. Instead, this book is calling for a celebration of our uniqueness, our origins, our heritage, and the beauty of the differences that actually make us Americans. I'm really interested in diving into this one, and can't wait to get my hands on a book. I've already pre-ordered.
Thank
So
you.
tell me a little bit about what prompted this book. I saw that it was prompted, well, the title of the book, You Sound Like a White Girl, is directly from a childhood crush of yours who said that to you. So what happened there?
Chris, I still remember him.
Oh, you're calling him out. Love it.
I mean, I'm happily married. But I mean, it was high school. But yeah, this kid in high school, I remember him telling me that I sounded like a white girl, and he didn't mean it as a compliment, right? He was Black, and he did not mean to praise me because I sounded like a white girl, but I took it as a compliment because I had spent such a long time trying to get rid of my accent, trying to belong in this country. And everything around me told me that the way you belonged in this country was to be white, that the way in which you were viewed as American was to be white, right? Like when I would watch all of these teen movies, and there would always be this like all American cheerleaders. They were always white and blonde and, uh, able bodied and thin and sort of what is standard considered beauty, right? And so I just always used to think like that's what you have to be, and like I became a cheerleader, and I would speak into the mirror in the way that the white girls at my school spoke, so that I could get rid of my accent. And so when he said this to me, I was like, oh my God, I sound like a white girl, like excited. And over time I started to realize that this idea of sounding like a white girl, of assimilating into whiteness, because let's just be very clear that when people say we should assimilate, they don't mean assimilate into anything other than whiteness, right? And whatever white culture is, because I don't even know what that is, but yeah, and over time I realized that it's a very racist idea, and it's an idea that's meant to tame me and make me small, and it's taken me a long time to break away from those ideas, and the book has gone through a transformation of when I first started thinking of writing this book, maybe like 4 years ago, um, and much of the research that I had to do for the book was reading history books and reading books by Latino historians that were telling a history of the United States that I had never heard before. Because when I was little, I always had this question, which was, where were we? Like, where were Mexicans? Where were Latinos when we were fighting for our independence from Britain? Where were we when Martin Luther King was having the March on Washington? Where were we when we landed on the moon? Like, where were we when um, the first women were allowed to vote? Like, were we allowed to vote? Like all of these things, I just never had the answers to them, and I wanted to know. And so that's kind of how the book started taking shape, was just kind of trying to get answers to these questions that I'd had all my life.
Yeah, and I feel like it's such a relatable experience for other immigrant families and whatnot, because when you pointed that out, it like brought me back to the same mindset that I had like growing up when I was a child, and not seeing my community out there represented in the world or in history and historical context. Now, granted, South Asians and Asians in general are perceived as more like newer immigrants, like they've been here for the
Mm-hmm.
past just like 20 to 30 years. And that's true of my parents. My dad got here in the 80s. But it's so wild that there are similarities though across the cultures. Um,
Yeah.
I was
And
in, I
I
took,
think like for like for specifically for like Chinese immigrants, and like not just Chinese immigrants but Chinese Americans, there's a lot of parallels
yeah,
actually, right? Because like Chinese immigrants, Chinese people have been in the United States for like centuries, and have roots in this country for centuries. And in fact, the very first law that excluded an entire race of people was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So, there's a lot of parallels, and I think, I also I read a lot of a lot of books about like sort of Britain, and I think Indian British people sort of have this sort of similar dynamic because of India being colonized by
the British, yeah.
Britain,
Mhm.
and so some of these concepts and ideas, like they might not be exactly, but there's like a lot of parallels of different of any community that's been colonized by a white
European or
European
yeah.
country,
Mhm.
you know?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. And those influences are still even there in India from, what I know, and what I've heard directly from my parents. So it's there are a lot of like implications that go on for generations. For me, similar to you, I took English as a second language courses, ESL courses, because my parents, when they arrived here, they did not speak English. And to this day, my mom still doesn't speak perfect English. My dad, he stayed up late to learn it and speak it with us after I came home bullied. I'm the oldest child, and so I was the first to go to school. And I, in regular classes, kept getting bullied, and ESL classes, it was still tough because I was learning and I still wasn't like fully grasping. And there was one time where I couldn't communicate that I had to go to the bathroom, and so I went in
Mm,
my chair, and things like
mm,
that just happened over time. And so when someone said that to me for the first time, what they said to you, that you sound like a white girl, I also took it as a compliment. And society also made me believe that that made me sound more intelligent.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was used in the context where I was using like big vocabulary words. And so
Mm-hmm.
another minority said this to me as well, like, "Oh, you sound like a white girl." And immediately my mind went like, "Oh, like I sound intelligent. I sound smart." And it's,
Mm-hmm.
looking back, I'm like, I
Yeah.
can't believe I used to think this way.
Yeah.
Like,
And then there's the flip side of that, right? Which is like our own communities using that like against us, right? And being like, I remember being told like I wasn't Mexican enough, or like I didn't act Latina. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, please tell me
yeah,
how I'm
yeah.
supposed to act, or like,
Right. And that was gonna be
so
my next
yeah.
question for you. Like, did you feel like you were treading this line of like not being, white enough for the white kids, and then not
Hmm.
being brown enough for the brown kids, or whatever community you belong to? Because that was me. The term that was used in among other South Asian American kids in high school was whitewashed. Like they would say,
Mm-hmm.
like, you're really whitewashed because if I was hanging out with my white friends, or if I was like, I don't know, doing activities that were deemed traditionally for white people.
Mm-hmm.
Like similar to you, I joined the dance squad. It wasn't cheerleading, but it was like poms.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was perceived that way, and then I was like, well, where do I fit then? Where do I belong?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, that's part of what I talk about in the book too, which is that, in Spanish, we have this phrase like, ni de aquí, ni de allá, like not from here, not from there. Right.
Mhm.
And more and more, I'm sort of claiming that I'm from both places, like I'm actually from here and from there. Um, and pushing back against like our own, like my own community, and that thinking within our own community, because like the truth is that like my experience as someone who was born in Mexico, someone who is Mexican, who spent 11 years of my life in Mexico, but who has now spent the majority of my life in the United States. I've been in the United States since 1994. so the majority of my life I have spent here, and I am different than the Mexicans who grew up in Mexico and never left Mexico. You know, my sister never left Mexico, and we're different. We talk differently. We have different experiences. Um, you know, I am also different than the third or fourth generation um, Mexican Americans who are, you know, many generations removed from being born in Mexico, and we are different, but we also, there's still a lot of things that connect us and that makes us a single community. At this, that's not to say that we're all the same, because we're not. But I think in those differences and that uniqueness is like where the beauty is found, you know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I see the differences between my own cousins. Both of my parents are one of eight, and they're the youngest of the eight, both of them.
Mm.
So my oldest cousins and I, we have like a lot of different experiences. They were born and raised in India, and then they came along with their parents um, around the time my dad got here, but he hadn't even started his family yet. And so the age gap is really big,
Mm.
but or wide, I should say. And for them, the way that they show up here is different than the way I show up as someone who was born and raised, but still trying to find my place here,
Mm.
right? Because I still look this way. In my first episode of The Quo, I talked about how in junior high I dyed my hair blonde and I got blue contacts because
Mm.
that's who the
The
boys.
color contacts in the
Oh
90s.
my God.
I
They were
had
so
hazel
huge.
ones.
Okay, nice. See, so you were a little bit closer to, you know, like I went straight blue and gray, and I'm like, what was I thinking? Like, why did I do this to myself? But when I looked at the magazines around me and the covers on there, you know, the cover girls on there, I'm like, okay, so this is a standard of beauty. And then in school, all the guys are gravitating towards those girls that look that way.
Mhm.
And the same thing with girlfriends, like they were the most popular girls, and it impacted everything I did. I ran for student council president, and you know, here I was like making all these, like putting all these like, you know, ideas together for what I want to do as student council president. And then the girl who ran against me, it was kind of more of a like fun thing for her. And she
Yeah.
was, you know, but also the most beautiful girl in school, and everyone loved her. And so she won. And I'm
By
like,
the way, I'm like, how is someone like more beautiful than you? Because you are like stunning.
oh, thank you.
So
That's
I'm
so,
like, how
thank
does that even
you.
happen?
Well, I was a very awkward child growing up. I think we all were, for the most part, right? But that that also goes to show that like I didn't think my brownness was beautiful at the time,
Mm.
you know.
Mm.
And if I'm being honest, I probably didn't really come to really own it and embrace it and appreciate it until recent years. Like
Mm.
as of late, I stopped dyeing my hair, even like just doing like light brown, you know, highlights, because I'm like, I love my black hair. It's
Yeah.
beautiful. You know, like I finally like owned who I am and the skin that I'm in, but it took a long time because society just for such a long time would always gravitate towards the beautiful white girl with the
Yeah.
blonde hair and the blue
Yeah.
eyes. And so, you know, it is what it
Yeah.
is. But that's why I think that like messages like yours are just so big and so needed in this space.
Yeah. And that's what I mean. Like, why am I going to spend time talking to like the racist white person when I can spend time like talking to us and having these kinds of conversations where we have shared experiences that are powerful, and, you know, hopefully we can sort of um, make sure that like the next generation knows how beautiful they are in their brown skin, you know, how much power they have, and how they should embrace it. I was just thinking about like Encanto, you know, the Disney movie that like
Yeah.
it's just being a big hit, and seeing all these like viral TikTok videos of little brown and black kids pointing to characters on the TV and saying like, look, it's me. And it's the first time they've ever seen someone that looks like them. And that's why like representation is so important, you know,
Agreed.
because
Yeah.
otherwise our view of the world is only dictated by people who are in power, who tend to be white straight males.
Yep. And that goes for like everything from superheroes, right? Like, cause like I'm a huge comics person. I saw that you compared yourself to X-Men, like growing up
Mm,
and just walking in among the world, like knowing you're different, but passing by people and them not realizing that like, you know, that you have this like hidden amazing talent and, you know, everything about you that you're sheltering from the world, but there is an amazingness and a power to you that you're hiding. And then recently, finally, like movies like Marvel are finally including, you know, characters that like are more inclusive of and representative of the population. So it was cool to see like in Eternals now. And I just hope that we can see more and more of that.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. And in leadership too. Right now I'm working with a client. It's unfortunate that these types of things still happen, and I'd love to hear your take on this, but I think this goes back to what we were talking about, kind of like not feeling like we belong in either of our piece of our identity. But she is a Latina who does not speak Spanish and has been persecuted as a result by the Latino community for not speaking Spanish. But growing up, because her family was assimilating, they made the conscious decision not to speak Spanish and learn English when she was born in a predominantly white neighborhood, and therefore her parents, you know, like did not teach her. So curious to hear what your like take is on that, and why there might be this like hostility towards not knowing a language and then associating it with identity.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot to unpack. And actually, I have a whole chapter in You Sound Like a White Girl about this,
Oh, great.
about language and about the lie of English is what the chapter is called. And you know, and a big part of that chapter is also talking about this pushback from within the Latino community towards other Latinos who don't speak Spanish, right? And I think part of it is a lack of knowing our history and like knowing why people stopped learning Spanish, which is that, you know, in Texas and California, there were separate Mexican schools. There were separate schools for like Mexican children were segregated in Texas and in California. And the reason that they would get segregated is because English would be used as the excuse why, right? They would say, well, these kids don't speak English, therefore they need to like be in separate schools. When in reality, the way that it was decided who would go to what school would be by looking at people's last names. So if you had a Spanish sounding last name, you would go to the Mexican school. And of course, these schools were not separate but equal. You know, they were separate and completely unequal. Like these kids in Lemon Grove, California, were they had classes in like a barn-like structure. 75 Mexican kids. Eventually, that was actually the very first lawsuit that was won in a school segregation case had to do with this Mexican kids in Lemon Grove, California. And you know, kids in Texas, they would get hit if they spoke Spanish in the classroom. And so there was a real threat to speaking Spanish. There was a real threat to someone's safety for speaking Spanish in the South, in the Southwest. And therefore, parents were afraid to teach their kids Spanish. Right? And that's how Spanish got lost over many generations. And I think that if we understood that and we knew that, we would have much more compassion to know why somebody might not have taught their children Spanish. Right? Now, on the other side of that is, I do personally, you know, I speak Spanish fluently, though my Spanish is not the same as a rich Mexican's Spanish, right? Like it's just not, and it's never going to be, because I stopped really learning Spanish when I was 11 years old. Right? And then I started learning English, and I only spoke Spanish at home with my parents. And then when my parents went back to Mexico, it was just like the phone calls, right? But I still speak Spanish fluently. I still read and write Spanish fluently, but it's very different type of Spanish than anybody else's. But I do think that, you know, for me, speaking Spanish does connect me to my roots, right? Because there's certain phrases and words that I can throw in there that only in Spanish do they sound. You know, it's like no translation. It's like this doesn't have a translation. That's not to say that that's the only way to connect to your roots. That's silly. That's crazy. But I think that if we understood more why it is that people don't speak Spanish, we'd have more compassion. And, you know, I don't think that Spanish is the only way to connect to your roots. Like, it's just, it's not. And my Spanish is not perfect. And people in Mexico want to correct my Spanish, and people in the United States want to correct my English. And I just say to both of them, I'm doing the best I can.
Amen. Yeah, I mean, same boat. The other day, in fact, my mom made a call to a friend in India, and then she put me on, and she's like, "Make sure that your Gujarati, which is my native language, is perfect." And I was like, "What am I supposed to do if it's not? Like, I speak it fluently, but you
Right.
know, I mean, it's going to be very obvious to someone living in India that I have a like an Americanness to my
Right.
language, right?" And so I think that you made an excellent point. Like, we just do the best we can, you know, and there are more than one ways to be tied to our ancestors, to our
Absolutely.
culture, to our roots. And so I think hopefully people can be more compassionate about that and understanding that, you know, we're all just doing the best with what we were given and what we have in front
Yeah,
of us.
exactly. Exactly.
And on that note, I want to make sure everyone knows where they can find your book, because it sounds like we can get a lot more of this in there, since we don't have all the time in the world, because I could keep going with you on our but yeah, I'd love for people to know where they can find your book.
They can find it anywhere the books are sold, you know, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, indie bookstores, Bookshop. Bookshop is a great place to buy books because they give back money to independent bookstores. But yeah, pretty much anywhere books are sold. There's also the audiobook, which I read myself,
Oh,
and you know, Kindle or whatever other ways that people read on devices. I'm still very much like I like to hold the book and I like to turn the page
me
person.
too.
But yeah, pretty much anywhere that you can buy books, you can buy the book. And I hope you do.
Yes, please go check it out. And if you haven't read her first book, be sure to do that as well. Well, first two books. You've got another one that has
Someone
come out
Like Me.
too.
The
Yes,
second one's
Someone Like
called
Me.
Someone Like Me.
Perfect. So yeah, check them all out, and you know, let us know what you think on the Quo community. Jaleesa, I cannot thank you enough for
Thank you
spending
so
some
much for having
time,
me.
for your openness, your vulnerability, and insights into a fight that the immigrant community has had to take on in solitude and fear and isolation for far too long. I hope we can see some meaningful change on this very soon.
Me too.
And to those watching or listening, I hope you can take away some light, some inspiration, and forward momentum. I hope you'll join us in our call to action. And Jaleesa, we appreciate you being among the leading voices in that call. Such important work you're doing. So thank you. And thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Hey, it's me again. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, and I really hope you did, please subscribe to the show on your favorite streaming service so that you're notified when new episodes are posted. Also, be sure to follow The Quo on social media at The Quo Media across all platforms for the latest and greatest. Thanks again for joining, supporting, and uplifting the Quo community, or as I like to call it, our Quo horde. Catch you next time.